Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for inviting me into your home again this week. And this week we have, I have discussed the topic of coercive control at length on my channel. And of course, we've gone into all the details and definitions and descriptions of how this applies in various situations, especially in cultic situations. But for quite some time, I've wanted to expand this conversation beyond cults or, gang or group situations to also, there's the dynamics of the one-on-one situation. And this has been something we've talked about, of course, where the similar control patterns or coercive, control or coercive persuasion or, the terminology for this are also utilized in domestic partnerships or in domestic situations, and that they can be just as abusive and just as traumatizing as a cult situation. And there are other areas, other places where coercive control is utilized against a person where they don't see it coming. And one of those places, and I actually wrote about this in a paper I wrote when I was doing my master's program, is in a therapeutic situation. When you have a psychologist or a psychiatrist or other therapy authority who takes advantage of that authority and utilizes that to take advantage of people under them who are coming to them for help. This is a problem. This is a situation that's been going on for quite some time in and out of different groups. And so we're going to talk about that today. I am bringing on as my guest this week, Emma Stevens. Now, she has written 2 books about 2 different situations where she has encountered abusive, traumatic, coercive situations as an adoptee, growing up in a traumatic family situation, and then connecting with a psychologist who did not necessarily have her best interests at heart. So, Emma, welcome to my show.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you for reaching out and letting me know about your story. And I wanted to, feature it here on my podcast because I think it goes right in line with all the things we discuss about coercive control and how that is, it can negatively impact a person's life. So you've had, unfortunately, a couple of bad experiences with this. I guess we might want to start at the beginning, or how do you usually want to go into talking about yourself and your story here?
Well, I think for my story personally, I'd have to start with that in utero, I was an unwanted baby. And that was not unusual I was in the 60s, and a lot of mothers that were unwed, they were shamed by their pregnancy, and they pretty much were coerced into relinquishment. And so I was swimming in toxic waters of cortisol and stress hormones. And so I really believe that it started for me in utero. Then when I was born, I was relinquished. Severing from, the only thing I've ever known. And so I think that was developmentally where it started for me to change and not really follow the normal course because I'm not with my mother. And that's just, by nature, that's what we need. Then I was given to a family that adopted me and my adoptive brother. And they just were not real kind people. They were not child-centered. They hadn't solved their own infertility troubles. And so all their inadequacies were placed on my brother and myself, and we were expected to be the people that we were purchased to be. And if we tried to be anyone else, then there was a lot of hell to pay. So I learned to conform at a very early age.
Right. That's a damn shame. Parenting is a difficult task at best, but when you have these like weird ideas that children are property, or that they're there to be molded into little versions of you rather than treated as independent human beings with their own minds and their own will and desires, it's very, very unfortunate. I don't want to get all ideological here, but it is a point that that there seems to be this idea in the United States, especially with the whole anti-abortion stance, that, adoption, and it's not really thought of very much about how that's actually going to affect the baby involved, the child involved in that, you know. So you make some good points there about things that people should consider on that topic.
Yeah, and I would also offer that if someone wants to know about the adoptee experience, they should probably ask an adoptee. But because that little baby grows up.
Right.
And it's funny how people don't really want to hear what an adoptee has to say because we'll immediately be called selfish, ungrateful, didn't you know that you were saved? And all, adoption can be beautiful, but all adoptees are asking is let's look at not only the pretty table setting that's on top, let's look underneath and tell the whole story of the whole thing of what a person goes through that has lost their family, their birth family, on the day they were born. And that's a grief that we need to be able to recover from and be told that you should grieve. It is a sad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can empathize to the degree that my brother is adopted, and he had, became very upset and concerned about this at an early age when he was informed, and tracked down his birth mother and got the situation there, which was not we're not going to get into all the details of that, but it was not a wonderful situation, and just watching and observing and trying to support him through that was a conflicting thing, because there was from my end, there was a little bit of an attitude, kind of similar to what you described, to my little bit of embarrassment here right now, because it was kind of there, like, well, what was inadequate about our family? What's the problem? And having to kind of put myself in his position and go, wait a second now, I'm the one who was the biological child. He's not, and there is a separation. There is an issue there, and learning and growing with him in that process was actually very educational for me. So I can empathize to that degree in understanding that. And you wrote a whole book about it. The book, The Gathering Place.
I did. And I use a lot of EMDR. I talk about how that helped me kind of integrate my early memories with my present memories and kind of do away with those erroneous beliefs I've always had about myself that have been limiting. Like, I'm a bad baby. I'm not, worthwhile. My mother gave me away. And really, it had very little to do with the adoptee. And it had more to do with the situation that was at hand. It was chaos. And so I internalized the chaos thinking it must be me. Right. So as soon as I used modalities like EMDR, it helped me really get back on path of saying, that's not mine to own. And in the book, I also use IFS, with internal family systems, where in the book I weave around going back to my younger parts and having conversations with them and giving them what they needed at that time, the understanding, and telling them future you gets to figure this out and you're going to be okay. And so I think that's what makes the book really lovely, is that at the end, it's not just a sad book, it's reconciliation of how to rise out of it and go to a different spot and out of a broken story and into the story I want to write for myself.
That's really nice. That's really good, because that does go toward, some degree of closure or resolution on the whole thing.
And I truly believe it, Chris. I'm not just saying it to say I wanted a happy ending. I never had joy in my life until 7 years ago. And now I see everything as an opportunity. And yes, I think you have to face your trauma and you have to get it unstuck out of your body. But at the same time, I look at things as more of an opportunity instead of, oh no, not just another thing I have to deal with, that attitude. So it's been very helpful to me. I wrote it to heal.
Right. I'm familiar with that process. What sort of feedback have you gotten? Has anything surprised you in terms of people reaching out to you after reading it and relating that to their own experiences?
Yes, a lot of what you just said. I've had zero pushback. I've had no one say, how could you? And I've recently come out and told people my real name is Linda Campbell Pivac. And I'm not even afraid if other people in my life, if they want to give me some pushback about how could you say things like that, I'll be ready to stand firm, use my voice, and know my truth.
Awesome.
So it's been very, and I've heard from other people where they want to share with me, they've written a letter to their infant self, like I do in the book, and they want to share that. And so it is pretty neat to, even though a lot of people aren't adoptees, but they still write me and say, huh, everything tracked with me from what you said, and I could put my own circumstances in it. So, as a writer, that is just music to my ears.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, I can relate.
Mm-hmm.
Are your adoptive parents still around?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm reconciling my names right now, is that both my parents have recently passed.
Okay.
They were the ones I was really trying to protect because there was no time left for repairing the situation, and their emotional maturity would never have allowed them to, accept what I had to say. So I wanted to use my voice, and using a pseudonym was my way of going ahead and speaking and not waiting until they passed. But now they've passed, and now I don't have to keep any secrets anymore. I am breathing fresh air.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'm really glad that you found that path and that you found some catharsis there with that. So unfortunately, that's not really all there is to your story, though. You had this path, you had this recovery, but then some other things kind of entered into the road, and there are lessons here, which is one of the reasons when you contacted me, I thought, oh yeah, this is something I definitely wanted to feature on my show, because it's we lead lots of lives in our lives. It's not just a one thing. I've been many things. You've been different things. And it's interesting. Please describe what happened with your husband and then therapist.
Okay, so this is talked about just briefly in the first book, but it's the whole topic of the second book. A fire is coming. Mm-hmm. And literally it starts off with a Laguna Beach fire of 1993. And we are running from the flames because the whole town was ablaze. And so the whole book is woven around fire, a real fire. And then it became a unethical, exploitative therapist became the fire. And she was trying to consume me. So that was jumping ahead a little bit, but I was telling you before we started how I was primed for this kind of exploitation because I grew up in a exploitative household with my parents, and then went and married someone that was on the spectrum of being a narcissist. And then my next door neighbor was a psychologist. We met at the mailbox one day, and I found out she was a psychologist, and I said, I've been looking for one. And so she handed me her card, and I literally was in her office the next week. I had no idea that it's unethical to accept your next door neighbor as a client. That is, okay, red flag number one.
Yeah. Yeah.
It gets worse.
Yes, and it does. It does. If we might step back for a second, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your husband and that situation, and then roll into this one, only to connect between the two things, I suppose. Mm-hmm. You mentioned being primed for this, and I'm just curious, in what way do you see that, and how did you connect with your husband, and when did it become apparent, or the red flags start appearing in your mind in terms of, oh, something's not quite right here with this?
It was due to my conditioning of when I was growing up with certain personalities, big personalities that left no room for anyone else in the room. And when I met my future husband, he was the creative director of the advertising agency where I also worked. And we were together almost on day one. And he had that kind of big personality and he was also 20 years my senior. So it didn't take much for me to be looking maybe for a parent. I had moved to California from my home in Oklahoma, so I was really a fish out of water.
I
And
see.
when I got this job in California, which I had gone to college for, I was ecstatic. And I thought, everything's falling into place. I'm in California, and now I've met this boyfriend. And we were together, like I said, virtually day one. And he had a very charismatic personality. And that's a theme in my life of these people with big personalities that I only later find out had an agenda the whole time. So,
Mm,
like, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. But I didn't know that at the time. I was
sure.
just thinking, this is great. So we eventually married.
It, cool.
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you some questions because I'm curious about a few
Yeah, go
things.
ahead.
And were raised in Oklahoma by adoptive parents. Were they religious?
No, they weren't.
Interesting for Oklahoma.
They had their own religion
Did they?
because they were their gods and they were my gods. So that's what made them cultic, because it was
Ah,
really a, information, like the bite model of, they monitor my information, my behavior, my exposure. And it was only, you're going to think this, you have no boundaries. And so I was just the conformist to a T.
interesting. How were they imposing this? Often, I brought up religion only because often it is utilized as a framework of
I,
control in
I know.
families, right?
Mhm.
Also moral foundations, etc. How did, if it wasn't through religion, how were your parents imposing this control on you?
They were both only children, and I think that had a lot to do with it.
Hmm.
And they were both on the spectrum of being narcissists. And they purchased my brother and I use that term intentionally
Hmm.
because we were a commodity of you. We were purchased to play the daughter and the son. And we were to not go outside of that role. And if we did, they were our gods. They could take food away, they could take clothing away, they could take anything away. And that was always really clear that we had to stay on the straight and narrow. So it
Mm.
does a lot of conditioning to your brain. And it's no wonder to me that I went out into the world after college and looked for the same situation because that's what I was comfortable with. Tell
Right.
me what to do, tell me who to be. And that's another adoptee thing of being a chameleon, because we tend to have abandonment issues and we want to just find out what will make you comfortable. We never ask ourselves. It's always, how can I conform to stay in the room?
Right. And that's certainly a theme that runs true through cultic activities as well. Was there physical abuse?
Yes, there was quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
quite a bit.
okay. And then you also mentioned food or sleep deprivation. Was that a purposeful campaign?
Yes. I don't know if it was a conscious thing in them, but they just, hmm, I think probably the physical abuse and the mental abuse of the verbal and the mental, and then followed up with physical, it just all was very heavy and it was consistent. That was the deal too.
Mm.
A very everyday kind of thing. And then you pour alcohol on it and it became explosive. So then
Oh,
my brother and I are walking around in fear all the time of, who are they going to be now? Who do I need to be now? Do I need to duck and roll and pivot? So we became very good at, or at least I think I was a little better than my brother. And I don't know why, but he seemed to get caught at everything.
interesting. Okay, I get that. By alcohol, do you mean your parents, were they both alcoholics?
They drank alcoholically. I don't know that they were, true blue, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day. If you drink alcoholically and your behavior is affected day in and day out, you might as well be, because there's no difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, for all practical purposes, then, yeah, you're an alcoholic. I,
Yeah.
I grew up in an interesting situation where my father was an alcoholic, but it was only on weekends. He was functional. I guess is the term for it, a functional alcoholic. He's no longer now. I mean, he's gotten well past that at this point. But growing up, it was difficult because the weekends were a wild time. But he would keep it under control during the week. Was it just 24/7 for you guys?
I would say yes. It was a daily event.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to
And
you.
then my brother became an alcoholic, and so did I.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, that tends to be how it goes.
I know, a learned
Yeah.
behavior.
Right. Okay, got it. So these are the things you're referring to. Was there any other? I just wanted to kind of get the background on, where this goes.
Yeah.
And so with your family situation, were there any other points or details that you feel are important to what occurred later in terms of priming or prepping or conditioning you for, your later life happenstances?
The gaslighting. I can't leave that out because it was a chipping away at someone's feeling of value and questioning their abilities. And when you have someone that is, especially my mother, didn't want anything to happen that didn't glorify her.
Oh.
So there was just a lot of gaslighting, and my responsibility as the dutiful daughter was to prop her up and take care of her emotionally.
Okay.
And I didn't do a good job of that. So that's why she was very unhappy a lot of the time. But honestly, Chris, I don't know if she'd ever have been happy, even if I did become a mini her and did everything she said. I don't know. Someone that's that unhappy, they're unhappy with themselves. And I don't know that there was anything at all I could have done about that. But I kept trying.
Right. Yeah, I get that. How did just because I'm kind of curious about your situation, how did the gaslighting manifest over time? What happened? What did she do?
Well, it got worse and worse the older my brother and I became.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she got more, addicted in her frame of mind, addicted to her own way of thinking. And then I can't leave my dad out because they were a partnership and he didn't protect us. He saw, I don't know if he knew everything that was happening, but I fault him because he was probably a little less of a narcissist, but he did not protect us. He was only there to glorify my mom. And when I became 11, 12, I became the other woman in the house. And that's a pretty awful feeling for a young girl that should be being helped with changing from a child into, a preteen. There was no help. It was just only ridicule and embarrassment and anything to rip the rug right under my feet.
That's awful. Okay.
It was pretty bad. And when I was 17, took me that long. She hit me for the last time. And I looked her in the eye and I raised my own arm up and I said, "Don't you ever hit me again." And she never did.
Okay.
But she was also very good at the mental abuse too, of any kind of, let me challenge your thinking and let me undermine you. Up until she passed a year ago, she was telling me, "How could you have gone out and looked the way you did in that picture that you showed on Facebook?" And I thought it was a pretty good picture. But she was leading to me to believe that I can't believe you went out looking like that.
Okay. So it was pretty blatant control of your appearance and your behavior.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I get it. And so you jump from that to this man who's 20 years your senior, who you fall immediately into a relationship with, and that ends up not being so wonderful either.
Yeah, I figured out it was smoke and mirrors, but that wasn't until after we were married. And I started to see that I again had grasped at a fantasy because he looked all shiny and good looking, and he's the creative director, but had no substance whatsoever. And that's a pattern in my life.
I get that. What were they, looking back on it now from their perspective you have now, How long was the courtship?
4 years we lived together. Yeah, it was a
Okay.
while.
Yeah. And so in looking back on it, what sort of red flags were popping up that you would say now were things you should have been paying more attention to?
He was in trouble with the IRS. They were garnishing his paycheck for back child support. And
Mm,
he led me to believe it was all his ex-wife's fault. And I believed him. And so that became a theme throughout our marriage also, that he had continuous tax troubles with the IRS and would lie to them. And that really kind of was the ultimate thing that broke us apart when I finally said, I have to go.
mm.
Because it was just the deceit. And it was just one sign of a much larger picture of that's who he was as a person, could not take accountability, felt like everyone else should give to him. He was very jealous. If you're rich, you should give me your money because I deserve it and you don't. That kind of thinking. It was very entitled.
Interesting. Interesting. And lying to the IRS, not just ducking out
Yeah,
on
he lied.
taxes, but actually fibbing.
Yeah, he lied. He
Wow.
did.
All right. I get it on that. Were there other aspects to the relationship in terms of other vectors of control, or was he physically abusive, or were there other things going on?
No, he was absolutely not physically abusive.
Good.
But he was on the debate team in high school, and he was very good verbally because he was a writer. And me coming from a home where I couldn't speak, I could have no boundaries. He could just box me into a corner with his words.
Got
And
it.
I felt defeated often. And plus, someone being 20 years your senior, they already have that power differential.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Get it. Okay. Got it on that. So not a great situation there. How long were you married, by the way, in total?
Longer, I kept on because I felt like we had children together
Mm-hmm.
and loved my kids like, just beyond anything. And I wanted to keep the marriage together, feeling it was the best thing I could do for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we were married for 12 years until my kids were maybe 10 and 8. And that's when I finally made my decision to separate and divorce.
Okay. Okay, got it. And then of course prior to that there was this therapist that entered your life.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into that. How long into your marriage did that happen?
It was very early. It was probably in year 2, the very
Oh.
beginning of year 2. So we were very fresh, but we were already having marital difficulties, which led me to wanting to seek counseling, not only for that, but adoption angst that I felt that I still had. And
Mhm.
also, we were having trouble getting pregnant.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Up until that point, had you had any other therapy or seen a counselor?
Very briefly, it was in college for a few sessions. I had no idea of what good therapy looked like or boundaries or, what is part of the therapeutic boundaries. I had no idea.
Right, right. We would not call you an educated patient or counselee, right? And
Uh,
that's a thing, by the way. I mean, I'm just to throw this out there for people because I've done a lot of talking on this channel about going about getting therapy, and actually, even I did a podcast with Rachel Bernstein, a licensed therapist, about
yeah,
how to find the right therapist for you because it is a little bit of or it can be a little bit of a shopping experience for some people, right? Trying to find the right fit, trying to find the person you can kind of connect with, but at the same time, not in any kind of weird, inappropriate way, in a
yeah,
professional way, right? In a way that you can trust this person and they can help you. And that's not everybody. That it's not a one size fits all thing. So not knowing any of that, not knowing how this stuff works, people can make mistakes and then come to the conclusion that it's all just bunkum and none of it works and therapy is useless, which would be an incorrect conclusion to make based on one or two bad experiences, but it's totally understandable how that could happen. So it's something that I try to help people with. And your cases would be a cautionary tale in that exact direction. So having said all that, or introed it that way, how did you said that you met her at the mailbox of all places. What happened exactly that she wrangled you in?
It was just all very unexpected, literally opening my mailbox. And in California, the houses are, very close together and the driveways are very short. And so we were just literally just standing face to face. And it just rolled out of, she said she was a psychologist. And I said, I've been looking for one. And then she said, here's my card, call me. And I immediately did. And then I was in her office the next week.
Right.
So
odds are if you know where your therapist lives, something's wrong. Just as a general rule, right? It is. There are ethical codes for therapists. There are licensed therapy operates on rules, and they are expected to follow certain ethical guidelines that are laid down for their profession. And personal contact outside of therapeutic situations, being friends, establishing personal relationships is not good. It's not okay. It's not something that is considered ethical behavior on the part of therapists. It's a very professional relationship, and it needs to stay that way. So that being just one guideline we could cite, what happened with her and you as you proceeded to connect up with her as a therapist?
Well, I told her all of my presenting symptoms of why I wanted to see her. And it was interesting that we never worked on any of those issues of being adopted or having trouble conceiving. And as far as the marriage, from day one, she started chipping away, just like dear old mom of my mom, chipping away at my resolve about my marriage of, oh, he's 20 years your senior. Doesn't that give you pause? And yes, it should. But you'll see that it just got compounded like a sociopath does. Of it wasn't just that, it was an insidious way of, I don't think he treats you well. Look how he does this. Let's get him in for counseling. So we did marital counseling together. And then she would just talk poorly about him in the next session to me, giving me her advice that I should leave him.
Wow. Okay. Definitely, again, not cool for what should be fairly obvious reasons. What were your thoughts at that time about this behavior? How were you reacting to it in the moment?
Okay, well, I think I have to loop in my adoptedness at this point because of my relinquishment of being severed from my birth mother and not having that relationship in my life. Then I did not get it with my adoptive mother either. And so this therapist from the get-go had told me and made a promise that I'm going to be the mother you never had. And so that was her offering my heart's desire on a silver platter. And so I believe it helped me disconnect all of my intuition of when a red flag would occur, I would go, whoosh it away, because the ultimate thing is I need a mom that I've never had. And she would speak to me in those terms. She would hug me like a mother. She would, it was just insidious the way it slowly built.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Slowly built. Until then she was hugging me in the beginning of the session and then at the end of the session.
Wow. Yeah. When you say boundary violations, you aren't kidding.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty bad. Yeah, physical contact, telling you, connecting analogies with familial relationships, which is absolutely something that cult leaders do. This is why they're called father and mother, often.
I get it.
I mean, it's not subtle. Wow. Okay. So what was just as a general, what was her, what was her physicality? How much older than you was she? How did she come across to you?
Well, she was 10 years older.
Hmm.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I've already told you I was a person in my past that liked shiny things, things that glowed, things that were too good to be true.
Hmm.
And she dressed to the hilt of polished, had
Hmm.
the doctor's glasses that she would lower and look at me and have a penetrating stare. And it would be the business suit that was feminine, but yet masculine, and it would be the perfect shoes, the perfect jewelry. She'd wore this perfume, which I kind of believe therapists shouldn't wear cologne because our senses are one of our biggest things to entice us. And she's wearing this perfume that is really heavy. And it was just another way to trip me up, to think of her as being something that I should have more of a relationship with than not. Then it became call me anytime, come over to my house. You're next door. I'm right here. You're not bothering me. Come on over. And so that began of where there was therapy, not only in her office, but she would claim it was therapy in her home.
Mm. Oh
And
yeah.
she said,
Mm.
bring your
Mm.
husband, bring him too. So he came over, but he would talk to the psychologist's partner, mate that lived in the house. And my psychologist would take me downstairs into her private office. And so things got really heated. And for me, my sense of agency and balance of stability really went on tilt because I didn't know what the freak was happening. All I knew is that I got to the point where she had told me I have to be vulnerable. She couldn't do her job with me unless I laid down all my defenses. And she would chip away at that until finally, over months, I was like, okay, fine, fine. I'm going to give it all to you. I'm just going to, you know, relinquish all control to you. And so then I was just in the palm of her hand.
Well, there you go, and that's exactly the opposite direction from where ethical counseling goes, because it's about self empowerment, not giving over your power to an authority figure.
Yeah,
That's the
true.
whole point. How interesting. So was she truly indeed a licensed therapist?
Yes. She still practices at the tune of $400 a session.
Oh my goodness. So
Yes.
I'm assuming, or maybe I shouldn't, so let me ask you. Well, let's actually just go ahead and go through the whole story because then we can see where this goes.
Yeah.
So she's clearly violating boundaries between the client-patient, therapist relationship, in bringing in her personal life and bringing in your husband and talking derogatorily to you about your husband, who
Yeah.
she ostensibly gave therapy to as well, which
Yes.
compounds the problem.
Yeah.
And this seems to have been agenda driven based on where this kind of went, which was, where did this go?
Well, at some point during the therapy, she confided in me her sexual preference,
Mm.
and she's a lesbian. And at that time, she had a mate in her house. I never knew that person was actually a patient of hers. Also, I came to find that out much later.
Hmm.
But anyway, I feel that from the time that she saw me at the mailbox, she knew that she was going to have me for her own. I think that was her agenda the whole time.
Hmm.
And she would get me to believe, just like is so common in this circumstance of therapists who abuse, is they let you know if you ever say anything, it's all your fault. You instigated this relationship, and if you do, you're not believing how special this relationship is. And I know that I wouldn't do that with anyone else, but our love we have is special. And that's so
Right.
classic. I didn't know that at the time, but now I know that's just the classic thing that happens all the time. And they're trying to gaslight you so you won't ever speak out and say, what you did was wrong. I'm taking you to court, or I'm going to the board of ethics and reporting you.
Right. Exactly. Exactly right. In looking at this through a lens of thought reform or coercive control, and looking at, the various things that she was doing, you've highlighted a couple things. I'm curious, what did she attempt? Okay, well, first off, how long did this relationship go on for?
Well, luckily, it did not last as long as what I hear a lot of people going through. If you watch The Shrink Next Door, Will Ferrell, right?
And Paul Rudd, yeah.
I think it lasted
Brilliant
20
show.
years.
Yeah, that went 20 years. That's right.
And anyone that thinks that this couldn't ever happen to them, watch that show, because it's a slow chipping away at your resolve.
That's right.
Until finally that guy owns his business, lives in his house, and all of that.
That's right.
So, but I was fortunate when I was doing therapy with her, it was about 3 or 4 months. And then she moved me into her home without my knowledge. She had a key to my house next door, and my husband and I were about to physically move to a different home. She still had a key. And one day while I was at work, she went into my home and got all my clothes, my personal items, and moved them to her house next door, called me on the phone at work and said, I did what I know are not strong enough to do. I've moved you in to my home, and it's just the two of us now.
And this was how long after you guys had?
About 4 months.
4 months. My goodness. So this went very, very quickly.
It did. There was a fire that I opened this up with. There was actual fire in Laguna Beach. And that kind of really progressed things to a faster pace. But I lived with her probably 2 more months. So I'd say start to finish, maybe 6 months of actually being involved with her. Yeah, about 6 months.
Okay, got it. Before you got out of that situation.
Before I got out, but my mind was still wrapped around for a long, many years later.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No. This was quite interesting. Okay, so you and your husband are going to move, and then suddenly you've moved out. And this was early on in your marriage. This was in the first few years. So what were his thoughts about and reactions to this?
Well, by then it was already apparent that when we go over to her home, and then she would take me downstairs for therapy, and he would be left upstairs, he kept asking me, what the hell's going on? So when I believe I did call him to say, I'm out of the house for a little while. I'm not going to be coming back. I'm not moving with you. And I didn't really leave him room to try to talk to me. And I know that I was off balance, and I didn't want to hear what he had to say. Because at that point, she had convinced me he was the enemy and that he was trying to take me down. And so she became my salvation.
Wow. In what ways, beyond what you've described so far, in terms of this chipping away process, this very quickly that this happened, and so I'm very curious about the details of this, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
How exactly did she make such an impact so quickly? Because I think a lot of people would hear this and go, "My God, what?"
Yeah.
And I have no problem believing this. I know how fast this can happen. So you're not hearing doubt in my mind. I just would like to develop the details of how did this play out so quickly for you? Troubled marriage to moving in with your counselor next door within that period of time is really quite surprising. So how did this happen?
It does sound crazy. But I would bring my adoptedness into it again. There's a hormone called oxytocin, and it's really a very needed substance that happens to bond the baby and the mother together. And it promotes better development and just, the relationship of them bonding together and thriving, the baby to thrive. So then fast forward to this is what this woman has been saying she's going to give me, be the mother I never had. She used oxytocin by anytime we hug someone, it's the cuddle hormone is what it's called. And it had an effect on me. to where she was embracing me, and it became more and more of an embrace and less of, just a little pat pat.
Mm-hmm.
And I remark in my book of where at one point, I'm thinking, that awkward point in a hug where you wonder, when are they going to let go? Should I let go? Anyway, I let my arms fall to my sides, and she kept hugging me. And I think that was a really huge, big flag to me, thinking, this is a sexual hug.
Mm.
And so it became more and more of a peck on the cheek. And then it was, I'm going to hold your hands. And then it was, I'm going to pull my chair right beside you and our knees are going to touch. Then it's my hands are going to be on your knees. And then I'm leaning in and she's kissing me during our session.
Wow. Okay. And there is zero question that is inappropriate behavior for a therapist and a client, right? Or a therapist and their patient. I mean, there's never, ever, ever an excuse for that. Just to be crystal clear, right? People
Even
might,
if I was stark naked.
yeah, I mean, people might get into, oh, well, maybe coincidentally you live across the street from each other. Oh, maybe socially, it wouldn't be so horrible every now and again to run into each other at the grocery store or something. Yeah, okay, fine. Sexual contact, forget it. There is no question that is a clear-cut ethical violation of their ethics, because there's never any positivity that's going to result in the patient therapy relationship with sex.
Yes, right.
Like, period. All it does is make things more complicated and worse every time, no matter what the context is.
Yeah.
There are very few totalist rules, you know what I mean? Absolute rules when it comes to therapy, but that would be one of them.
And that's exactly what they're taught day one when they enter their program. So it's not that they've never heard this before, but unfortunately, it seems like a lot of them think it doesn't apply to them. This is different. This is true love. And so they get caught up in their own stuff that they haven't solved. Exactly. And people are people, but that would be one of those things that if we fast forward into how to choose a therapist, that you may want to think of some of these things to ask and find out about. Absolutely.
Now, in that time, there's the physical boundary violation, slowly, sort of frog in the boiling water effect, right? Creeping up on you.
Yeah.
Were there other subtle or what ended up being not so subtle efforts or advances on you beyond that?
There was something that she used that was, I call it the reward and punishment, of where she would applaud me. I was the best ever. I looked just like Jennifer Aniston. I walked on water, whatever. And then it would be followed by punishment. And so there was that, applause, and then there was the hook. And that was very familiar to me also from childhood. But
did you grow up with that as well?
Oh, just the gaslighting. Yeah. Again, it was very, if I was doing something that glorified my parents, I was golden. But then if I started developing or showing a tendency to like something they didn't understand, then it would be, we're going to slash you down to size and to where, you won't even feel like waking up the next day.
Wow.
It was pretty bad. It was pretty bad.
Okay.
Yeah. And she knew that technique also of to keep me off balance and not have agency over my life.
Right. It sounds like she was engaging in a form of what we would refer to as trauma bonding.
Oh, definitely.
Right. Where you have this alternation of reward and penalty. With what tends to happen is it will start with what we might call manipulative kindness. I love that term, right? Love bombing.
Oh, yes.
Right. This idea of overly complimentary, you're as you just mentioned, you're the bomb, you were Jennifer Aniston, you look amazing, you're so smart, you're so intelligent, you're so clever. but then mixed in with these subtle punishments, and then gradually over time, the punishments increase and the rewards decrease.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
And in seeing that or in discussing that, like how did that play out for you with her?
I would say the biggest punishment she gave me, and this was right before she moved me into her home, but she dropped a bomb on me when I didn't come to dinner one night when she wanted me to. And she told me that I was either bipolar or that I had, what was the other personality disorder? Bipolar, or I can't think of it right offhand. But diagnosing me with a mental disorder, and you have to scroll it back and remember, I knew nothing about psychology. I knew nothing. All I knew is that she had credentials and I didn't. And she, a doctor, was telling me I had this. And so that severely hobbled me to thinking that, well, doctor, please, help me. If I am that bad off, please help me.
Right. Well, that's exactly the whole point is, I'm in the position of power and I'm the only one who can help you. Yeah. Did that language start appearing, by the way, this business of I'm the only one who can help you?
Oh, definitely. And that's where she was able to exclude my husband. He's so bad for you, but how I would take care of you is so much better. And I'd be telling her, I'm not a lesbian. And she just glossed right over that. That doesn't matter.
Right.
You'll get used to it. Or I don't know. It was really a question in my mind because it was incongruent with who I am, because I'm not a lesbian, but yet I was attracted to her. But it was more from my little baby self that just wanted to hug her and wanted that mother love. And it all mixed up with sexual feelings. And there's actually a term for that that's called genetic sexual attraction. And it happens for adoptees that sometimes in reunion, when you've met a family member that you haven't known your entire life, but you meet them, and there's some immediate attraction that, as we're adults, sex is involved, meaning that it can get confused of where I just wanted to hug her, but then it became sex.
Right.
And it was like, how does this happen? But it's actually a very documented thing.
Understood. The biological components there. Yeah, it's this again, and that's exactly the reason why. One of the many laundry list of reasons why you just can't enter that into a therapeutic relationship. Period. There's just never any excuse for it. Yeah. Because it makes things so confusing, because it brings in chemical reactions. You talked about oxytocin earlier. There's all kinds of, brain activity going on. And this is bonding activity. This is not just about physical pleasure. This is about emotional commitment. These things are are how we think about what feels good and what feels bad, and what drives our emotional needs is a lot of these chemical processes. So confusing these things, and love is already confusing enough between families and adoptees and sexual partners. There's already enough mess up in there, and then you're going to have the therapist bring this in. I'm really aghast at that whole scenario. It's really quite awful. And again, appeared to be agenda driven from the very beginning. She targeted you. It appears. I really think so.
She was grooming me the whole time.
Yeah, and that's where that's a very correct use of that word. We find right now a lot of incorrect use of that word grooming being done right now for ideological agenda driven propaganda purposes. And that kind of drives me a little crazy because then it tends to water down situations like this.
Yeah.
Where you become a target of somebody who is in a power position and they start working you over. And that repetitive process of working you over and wearing down your defenses and changing your value set is what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
That's grooming. And that's a real psyop. You know,
Yeah.
it really messes with you, and it has long-term consequences if you know, until you kind of figure out and learn how this stuff works and can kind of take it apart. I'm curious, in the process of her doing that, of that grooming process, was confession ever part of the confession of the therapy process or the relationship? It doesn't have to have been. I'm just curious if it
Yeah.
was.
I mean, confession that she would start to tell me all the people that she had inappropriate relationships with.
Oh my goodness. Well, I was sort of thinking of her asking you to confess things to her, but that's interesting that she did that way.
Well, and I did let her know that I had written a journal ever since I started therapy with her because I was trying to make sense of my emotions. And I'm a journaler, I'm a writer, right? And she said, "Oh, I'm going to need to read those."
Uh-huh.
So she immediately, her hair was standing up, and I could tell the insistence of, she was very panicked. And I did let her read them.
Hmm.
And I don't want to fast forward too much, but those would come up again in the story at a later
Mm-hmm.
point. But as far as her confessions to me, I started to realize she was using her client pool as, her victims, of
Right.
her car dealership guy, of the person that did her yard work, of her, all of the mates that she's been their therapist. So she was using her pool, to fortify her life.
Wow. Because yeah, while she's doing all of this, she's charging you for it.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
It
Jesus, man. What a gig. Um,
was,
okay. How interesting. So, how did this proceed then? I mean, this seems to have happened very quickly, overwhelmed your life. You were still working during this time as well?
I was trying my hardest, but my head was not even attached to my body because I was so off balance.
Right.
And advertising is a very fast paced business. And I was late. I wouldn't show up places. I'm not sure how I didn't get fired, to tell you the truth. But yes, I was still kind of working. And, but it became clear to me that she started to want me to just take care of her household. Once she moved me in with her, she started saying, "Why don't you quit your job? I've got this nice beachfront house overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and you don't need to work. But what I'd like you to do is take care of my house, my dogs, my cleaning, you could get dinner ready. You could." And that's when a lot of stuff started going, a little
Mm.
clarity started seeping through, of like, what is this? What's this all about? Because she liked to say how much more important she was than me. And by that time, I'd virtually lost my job. And it almost became where I was just her servant in her house doing her things.
Right. That sounds exactly like the direction she wanted to go in, is just make you into her housewife. She said to you that she was more important than you were?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mm.
I have this early morning meeting with my client, and you're making me late for it, and you're interfering with that. And if you had gotten dinner ready on time, then I wouldn't have had to cancel this, and blah, blah, blah.
I
So,
see.
like you said earlier, the punishment really started showing up.
Mhm.
And what the other interesting thing, which helped me escape, is that her mask started falling. She couldn't maintain this persona of perfection and angel. She couldn't do that forever. And it started slipping, and her behavior became erratic. She'd start yelling, she'd start slamming me against walls. And I became quite afraid of her. And again, she reminded me of my adoptive mom.
Right.
And
Right.
once I got enough taste of that and enough energy, one, and this was what I highlight in the book, is my escape of it gave me the adrenaline and fuel to grab all my stuff while she was at work one day, and I left and I never came back.
Excellent. Excellent. So good if we're getting out of that situation,
Yeah.
obviously. Um, I couldn't help but think of the 90-day rule. Somebody told me this one time, and I'll just share it just because it's maybe helpful. Um, the 90-day relationship rule is you never, ever, 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 ever make any important decision in a relationship until 90 days have passed, because nobody can keep a mask on for 90 days. Eventually it starts slipping, right?
Yeah.
Because there's often people will dive right in. I mean, you see people get married in a week or two or three or whatever, or move in, or, time to meet the parents, or trying to, let's do something big, moving this thing forward. Give it 90 days. See who the person really
Right.
is. Pretty common sense, really. So, what happened after you left? Did she come after you? Did she pursue you? Where was your husband in this now?
He had moved to a home that was real close in the neighborhood. And he had, during this whole time I was with her, because we worked at the same agency, and he was feeding me a little information at a time. And I started to chew on it and consider it, to think if I was being taken advantage of,
Mm.
because I was still thinking, is he the enemy or is she my savior? And the scale started to tip. Her mask came off. I started listening, and when I had that adrenaline to leave her, I didn't have any other option, I thought, at that time, other than to go back to my husband.
Okay.
And then we stayed together for about, 10 years after that. And we did have two children. And um, this all happened 29 years ago, by the way. So,
Wow.
yeah, 29 years ago.
Wow.
Uh, it took me that long to get it out of me and onto paper.
Got
I
it.
wrote my first book, and then I thought, wait a minute, I'm not done. I've got to write about this horrific experience, not only to heal for myself, but to have other people look at that and say, oh my gosh, I thought something was wrong in my relationship with my therapist, but I didn't know. And so, if I could create any awareness, which is why I had Yanya Lalich, I was honored by her endorsing my book.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I read Take Back Your Life. And so I've really educated myself on how it happened, what happened, how to not ever let anything like that happen again. Because there are cultic situations everywhere, as you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so, including in these one-on-one relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah, we call them pseudo-therapeutic cults when they involve a therapist or a counselor, because it is not therapy. It is pseudo-therapy, right? It's fake therapy, really,
Yeah.
because the person's only running a pretense of being an ethical counselor or therapist. Or
Mhm.
psychiatrist even, and we've seen groups that have gone off the rails with this. Primal Scream was a wonderful example. In fact, one of the biggest examples, because the psychiatrists and therapists involved ended up losing their licenses and being sued to the tune of more than any other single suit, I believe, something like that. That was really popular in the 60s and 70s. That's kind of ancient history, but it happens all over the place. And it's something I try to stress with people is acting classes can turn into little cults, and martial arts dojos can turn into little cults. All it takes is somebody who is willing to abuse their authority and lord it over other people in order to create that situation. And therapists are human beings too, and predators can enter that profession just like they can any other.
Right.
Were there any further consequences or efforts to pursue her in terms of reporting her, licensing board, anything like that, or did you just move on?
No, I couldn't move on. I needed to report her to the Board of Ethics.
Huh?
She was a psychologist, also a social worker. So I reported her to both boards. That took a long time. I also got an attorney, and there was a civil lawsuit against her. It's public. Um, it's in the public. What do you call it?
Domain?
Court. Yeah,
Public
the public
records?
domain.
Yes.
It's it's been documented. Okay.
Yes.
And so we ended up settling out of court because it was a sizable amount. And by that time, I was only influenced by her for 6 months. Remember that whole actually being abused by her. But the court proceeding lasted until almost 97, which was, 93 to 1997. And I was ready to be done with it. I couldn't move on until I did what I needed to do to protect others. But at the same time, I couldn't fully let it go until I didn't have to do, court proceedings and documents and show up to court and remember things, have to tell people what happened. So I was ready for it to be done by that time.
Sure. That makes complete sense. And it's an all too common, end result of civil suits as they drag on and on and on. We've seen this in Scientology, with Scientology lawsuits over and over again. They just go on for years and years and years.
Yeah. And they whittle your resolve down because they want it that way. So you will give up and walk away.
Yeah, exactly. Because systematically it might not be justice, but it is a one way to deal with the volume of cases is just make it take forever. So what were the end results of that? You said you got a sizable settlement from that. Is she still practicing? Did the licensing boards take any action against her?
The Board of Psychology gave her minimal restriction, and she was able to reinstate after a couple of things were required. So it didn't, actually, I'm sorry, let's reverse that. Mm-hmm. It was the board, the social workers that let her reinstate. That's what she's practicing under now. Okay. The Board of Psychology revoked her license, and she's never tried to get it back. But she didn't really need it because she's under social worker, and she's able to get $400 a session current present day.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I am very happy to hear that at least the APA pulled her therapist license. Because her behavior was unquestionably, I mean, if what you said is true, it's unquestionably unethical, and it crossed lines that are not, you just don't get a second chance when you are so blatantly disregard, the rules of your profession. But that is disappointing about her social work.
Yes, I know. I agree. And we were unable to get the other people that had been abused by her. Unfortunately, they had been so psychologically damaged that they were not up to doing an appearance in court or even filling out a document. So it would have made it a lot stronger, but it really shouldn't have. If I've found all of those things were documented, one person should have been enough to say, we're going to revoke your license. You don't need to be practicing and hurting other people like this.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so awful. And of course, in what you've described here, if y'all been paying attention out there, you see, so many of the various components of thought reform and control that we talk about on this channel, right? Between, the sort of, if you lay down Lifton's points, right? I mean, you got, the whole dispensing of existence and the milieu control and the, sort of just authoritarianly taking over somebody's life, in other words. It's all there. These are the components of controlling people. And looking back on it now, beyond the things we've talked about, were there any other red flags or other things, the warning signs that you now would be looking for or would warn people to watch for in similar circumstances?
Well, I would say you're not, don't believe that you're special because they give you their personal phone number, and don't let them say you can come over to their home anytime. If your session is 50 minutes to an hour and it becomes 2 hours, that's a red flag. If they excessively touch you, that's not okay. Just maybe not even touch you at all, really.
Pretty much. Yeah, the boundaries are pretty clear.
Hands in our lap and...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I could see exceptions in terms of comforting a person who's experiencing a trauma or a difficult moment and would like a
Yeah.
little bit of comfort in that moment. But there are huge differences between that and, advancing on someone. And always it is up to the patient, the client, as to when and how they will be touched. I mean, that just as far as putting that down there, no
Yeah.
therapist should ever be imposing themselves physically on a client. Good points, all that you have made here. Now, that all being said, is there anything more to this story that we haven't covered yet?
I don't believe so. I think we've laid it all out there.
Mhm.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, the hashtag I got out.
Yes.
Okay. Hashtag I got out.
Yes.
But once you get out, then what do you do as far as deprogramming? And I
Mm.
was mandated to go to another therapist for the court proceedings. And she was very nice, pleasant, did a nice job. I probably needed someone that was real low key, but she was not schooled in how to deprogram me. And she was not aware of the psychological damage that happens as a result of all those little hooks that I needed someone to help me unhook.
Right.
So I think that remains an issue of who to go to when something like that really, that dramatic happens, of how to, because I was suicidal. I didn't know if I wanted to live anymore. And it was almost worse after I left her than the horror of living with her.
Right.
It was a
Right.
slow climb out of that hole. And honestly, it's because I got pregnant and I forgot I was able to then fixate on being pregnant.
Right.
And
Well,
I think that's another reason it took me 29 years, is because I've been raising my children all this time. And, not that I haven't thought about it, and I've had much more therapy now. Uh, but it's a process I'm going to be unraveling until the day I don't walk this earth anymore.
yeah, it's an ongoing process for sure, and it's interesting. I don't know how you feel. I'll throw this out and you tell me what you think. But for me, it was when I first got out of Scientology, and this is after decades in it. I thought, if I'm still talking about this in a year, I want somebody to stop me. and after a year, I was like, oh, yeah, no, this is going to take a little longer. and, and it was about 2 or 3 years out that I was like, oh, yeah, this is probably a lifelong thing. I'm going to be working on this for a while. And one of the
Yeah.
reasons I believe for that is because at what point do you know yourself? Right? At what point can you call it quits on, oh yeah, I learned it all. I got it all figured. I got myself taped. I totally understand it all. Like, at what, really? Like, there isn't one, obviously, right? Spoiler alert. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I'll even say, I hope there isn't that day that I feel like that I've learned it all. Because
Yeah.
that's part of the fun of just, the more you learn, the more you can get liberated from. And that just makes life fun, and looking at opportunities of, how can I attack that and be better at it than I did 10 years ago, whatever. I don't really want the journey to be over.
Me too, exactly, and that's why I think it's, if you embrace it and look at it as a constructive learning process and a productive way of getting through your life, then it becomes a bit of a different attitude and flavor than, I'm in recovery and I'm always going to be carrying these chains of trauma around with me. And I get it. I mean, I've been traumatized. I think we all know that it's not a pleasant experience. But
Right.
but you have choices in how you face your future. Once you escape from that traumatic situation, you don't have that oppression on you anymore, then you do get to make some choices about how you feel, how you want to approach things, and learning. And I can't imagine a recovery process that doesn't include lots and lots of learning. How has your journey been with that?
It's been very similar. Of things started to connect. I started connecting the dots. And now that I am where I am on my journey and I can look back, I see that everything was all connected. It wasn't isolated cases. There were no tangents. It was all connected. And now that I know my patterns and I'm aware, I can very, very much say I steer clear of anything shiny, anything that's too good to be true. And I've embraced my adoptedness, meaning that I've made it more of my superpower than letting it do me in. I had to befriend it. And I think I befriend a lot of the things that help me just gain more and more understanding about new things all the time.
Perfect. I think I completely agree with that. That's awesome. So on that happy note, and it is good. There is a happier ending here. Now, under the pen name Emma Stevens, how do people find your books and work?
Well, both books are on Amazon in all the formats. And then I'm also on Audible for both the books. And then as far as the social media, it's at Emma Stevens Writer for Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.
Excellent. Okay, good. Well, I will put those links in the description here so people can find your work and look up your books on Amazon, because I think they should check them out. And I'm very, very happy that we had this talk today. Thank you very much for being on my show.
Oh, me too, Chris. Thank you so much.
You bet. All right, folks out there, now, just because I have to, put this out there because I don't think I say it enough, and in line with what we were talking about today, if you want some consultation, I am not a licensed therapist and I am not going to give you therapy. But if you're looking for help or consultation or support or guidance or education on the topic of coercive control and cult education and all of and maybe getting out of that situation, contact me. Hit me up. Let's talk. I can help with that. So you can contact me at the email address in the comment section below or via my website, which is also linked below. Thank you very much for coming around, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.